There we go. It's recording. And yeah, I do put these all on, I've got like a YouTube playlist of all the videos of our conversations, our discussions of these texts, in case you miss it. Often people who have, I mean, the list for the people who are interested in this must be 50 or 60 people long. And often they ask, they can't make it, please send me the link to the video. And if you have to leave early too, you can come see how things ended, what the final conclusions were about the readings. I'm sorry we missed January. I'm sorry I missed January. I sort of fell into a winter break black hole, and took me a while to recover back out of it with the new semester. But we are back, and the reading for today, Philosophy or the Theory of Science, is one that if I ever read it before, I didn't remember it. So I was excited to read this again and get into it. It struck me as one of the nicest, most succinct discussions Gadamer has for his view of sort of the development of the relation of philosophy and science, going back to Descartes through Heidegger, and then raising these general questions about the limits of philosophy and the limits of science. So as is tradition, I'd like to invite somebody. If there's something that you really want to make sure we talk about, get it right here on the table at the start. I encourage you to raise your hand or put the raise hand button, and we'll jump into the text. Yes, Eric.
So I had a question about, I'm going to lower my hand just a second. Okay. Reactions. Sorry. It's what page of the PDF? Page 7 of the PDF, the right-hand page. I think I'm not seeing the page numbers on the scan. So yeah, the top of the page starts with implied in every theory of science itself is the idea of self-justification, that page. The paragraph starting with Heidegger's critique of the notion of consciousness. Okay. So Gadamer calls this a breakthrough. And then later in that line, he says, rather the complete thought form of transcendental grounding collapsed. And honestly, I don't get that. I don't get what he's saying when he says the transcendental grounding collapsed. Like, I would understand it if the translation was the transcendent grounding collapse, but why is the transcendental grounding collapse? I just don't get why it's collapsing, breaking through what?
Got that. That's on, I think it's on page 162. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. Yeah, great question.
There's a place. There's a place where Gadamer says the same thing somewhere in Being and in Truth and Method, where he says the idea of grounding underwent a complete reversal. And it's just another way of expressing the same point. It's a tough one. It's definitely it's good question, Eric. But the whole, I guess this is one way that Gadamer says, okay, here's where Heidegger departed from modern thought and from phenomenology, ontologically speaking, and that's all I can say right now till I find this other quotation I was thinking of.
Jim, you want to speak to this question?
Yes, John was saying the essential point. Look, it's against Husserlian phenomenology more so than anything else, the transcendental position of Husserl, at least initially. And so for Heidegger, it's a question, it's the very meaning of hermeneutics to not be in search of a ground. So Heidegger's hermeneutics of facticity is actually an attempt for Heidegger to clarify the phenomenological method. I mean, that's in the writings before Being and Time, that's the main thrust of Heidegger's work, to say that the method itself needs clarification. And so hermeneutics is precisely a non-transcendental framework for philosophy. And that's why, just to extend the point, that's why I had my friend Fred Lawrence, who translated this book, at one point was insisting that Gadamer was something of a Kantian. And I resisted that at every stage because of Kant's, precisely because of Kant's transcendental framework.
Good.
That's great. Greg. Greg,
Yeah,
go
I,
ahead.
I,
Yeah.
just to build on that idea and yeah, connect it up a little bit more with Kant. I mean, I take it that the way transcendental is functioning in passages like this is that the transcendental project is the project of like taking all of the things that condition our thinking, right? All the stuff that our thinking is dependent on, and raising that up to the level of like explicit awareness so that we can, so that reason can be kind of fully in possession of itself and not dependent on anything that it hasn't like given its own stamp of approval to. And finitude, as Heidegger understands it, amounts to the claim that like that sort of thing just in principle can't be done. And in fact, it's like not even a coherent idea to think of a kind of understanding that would be in full possession of itself in that way. And so that's why I think he's saying, the project didn't just suffer a setback here, it just fell apart. Like if you buy what Heidegger's selling, then you see that this is just not a thing that even makes sense to try to do.
Yes, Jim.
Can I add one thing? Yes, I'm not opposed to that, but it's also the transcendental condition is also a condition of a reflexivity with respect to apprehension. And that's precisely what hermeneutics is opposed to. So that gets back to the whole idea of, even for Heidegger, you have it, the enactment of the situation. And that distinction that Gadamer refers to that he got from Heidegger between the actus exercitus and actus signatus, the act of signifying and the act of the doing, and then the act of signifying the doing. So that reflective moment, again, is out of sorts with the hermeneutic project, the project of hermeneutics.
Is this helping, Eric?
Somewhat, yeah.
Somewhat. Was there something you wanted in light of those things? Was there something?
Well, I guess like with Greg saying that it's about the transcendental project of Husserl tracing back to Kant, is that we've got this attempt to make explicit to ourselves the necessary conditions for any specific experience or any specific thought process whatsoever. And I guess I don't see how that's inconsistent with trying to establish particular hermeneutic principles, right? Like we can only understand an answer, or we can only understand something to the degree that it answers a question. Well, isn't that a universal principle for any hermeneutic? And isn't that just what transcendental analysis is?
Yeah, so aren't there still transcendental arguments, transcendental analysis
Yeah.
in the context of hermeneutics?
Yeah.
Yeah, Ted, do you want to get in here?
Thanks. Yeah, maybe I have two things to say. I meant to say one, but I think first of all, I do think transcendental in this context might mean more than universal and necessary, because it also entails the idea that something is universal and necessary because grounded in the apodicticity of self-conscious understanding. So, I might be able to derive universal principles about all kinds, maybe in mathematics or something, but if it's not grounded in the kind of apodicticity of my self-conscious awareness of myself, then it's not really a transcendental, it's coherentist or systemic or something like that. Like, if you have the sides of a triangle and you say that adds up to 180 degrees, that's universal and necessary. It's not necessarily a transcendental claim unless you believe, as Husserl did, that kind of thing is grounded in our self-conscious awareness of ourselves, the kinds of structures that our consciousness has that we can be aware of. But I would also add on the other side, and this is the point I wanted to make with Jim, it's also important to remember, though, that hermeneutics isn't, that the breakthrough that Heidegger had with the hermeneutic or facticity, it's not just then that this is an empiricism. Like, I think what Gadamer wants to point to is that there's a kind of paradoxicality, that on the one hand, there's the claim of an a priori structure, namely facticity, which, however, suggests that there aren't any a priori structures that we can ground in consciousness. So that it's kind of a paradoxical problem. At least that's how I think. Jim, you might think I'm wrong, but that's kind of how I thought about it. I think in the section of the text, John, that you're talking about, when he talks about the Heidegger's breakthrough, when he's talking about the shift to the ontological founding of hermeneutics, that he talks about paradoxicality and the discovery of facticity.
I found the text, actually. I can
Okay.
just, it's 257, truth method. It says, but it soon emerged that what constituted the significance of Heidegger's fundamental ontology was not that it was the solution to the problem of historicism, and certainly not a more original grounding of science, not even as with Husserl, philosophy's ultimate grounding of itself. Rather, the whole idea of grounding itself underwent a total reversal.
Okay.
And that's hard to grasp for people like Rorty. I don't think Rorty quite got that, but that's from Truth and Method. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Thanks, John. Thanks for looking it up. I think the next question is interesting.
Well, I want to just
yeah, there,
to
go for it.
respond to John there. I mean, that's, for me, 257 Truth and Method, where he's talking about that, right, to say that it's ontological grounding, right, the fundamental ontology, right, is that we can ground it ontologically is called into question. Okay, why in this other article is he saying transcendental instead of ontological?
Well, Heidegger once says that transcendental is just another word for ontological. But so there is that connection. And as everybody was, as Jim and everyone was saying, that it's like transcendental is an a priori thing. It's a form of a priori knowledge where it's necessary for the possibility of something to happen. And yeah, Heidegger, basically, and actually with Jim, like yeah, Gadamer was not a Kantian at all. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I would say one kind of transcendental grounding you could give would be a kind of ontological grounding. So if you're Descartes, I think, therefore I am, that's a kind of ontological argument, moving from here's an experience to what must be the case that explains and grounds the possibility of experience. And I think when we're talking about what's going on in Heidegger here, they're both converging, but it doesn't have to, but transcendental arguments don't have to appeal to something ontological as a kind of grounding. They could have other kinds of relationships.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, Heidegger was being a little rhetorical there when he said that.
I thought that, can I take things to the next line in the reading? Oh, Henry, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see your hand there. Welcome, Henry.
Long time. Yeah, so that discussion just now seems to brought up another question for me, like in just the preceding part that Eric cited. Gadamer mentioned the Lebenswelt that was in the later Husserl, especially in the crisis, right? And then immediate following that part, he talks about the the a priori of the self-referential character. So that is the transcendental ego's part that Gadamer thinks is failing phenomenology. But if we look at crisis, right, the Lebenswelt is fundamentally intersubjective. So at that point, Husserl, at a later Husserl, he already introduced the notions of like community in the subjective into his phenomenological reduction. So like, is like, it seems like at the beginning part of this page, Gadamer recognizes this in Husserl, and then immediately he just like parrots Heidegger's critique of Husserl, which seems a bit weird to me. Or maybe it's just me, or like I'm interested to see if other people's, like, what do other people think about this like kind of weird flip-flop there.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I'm coming from too, Henry, because it's like I want to protect Husserl from being a whipping post.
So go ahead, Jim, you're up. You're my sir.
Yes, well, as David Vesey can tell you, Husserl is not a whipping post, certainly for Gadamer. And I would say Heidegger, of course, as that great thinker, always wants to distance himself from the previous king, so to speak. But anyway, to the point, I think while the comments are very good on this whole question you're raising, to me, the short of it is, I should have said this the first time around, the question of the transcendental in this context of this essay is, where does philosophy begin? And for Husserl, it begins in a way that it does not for hermeneutic phenomenology. And I think that's the crucial point. That's the hermeneutic gesture about you can't frame a method apart from the givenness of where you start. And that's Heidegger's, that's a crude way of talking about Heidegger's critique of Husserl. And this gets to Henry's point, Heidegger's critique early on in the early 20s. Remember, the Crisis of European Sciences from 36. And that's, so Heidegger's critiquing, you might say the early Husserl, but it's not really the earlier. And so the question of the crisis is still a question of the foundation, though. Even though Gadamer is very sympathetic to that foundation of the life world, it's still a question of foundation that hermeneutics never wants to take up as a philosophical question.
Yeah, great. Greg.
Well, David, were you getting ready to say something there? You can go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think the reference to Husserl here, the a priori, the puzzles connected with the self-referential character of phenomenology. I think what it's referring to are the troubles that Husserl had with the temporalizing structures of consciousness, where he just kept having to step back to a kind of primordial, the streaming living present. And then in the streaming living present, he had to reestablish what he called the Ur-Ich, the more primordial ego, which then was self-constituting itself in time. And he started getting into these sort of paradoxes of how do you establish the constitution of time without a constitutor? And then how does the constitutor come to appear in time? And he needed to do that because he constantly needed to have a level he could step back to that then would allow a certain sort of, apodictic self-awareness. So I think Gadamer was referring to those discussions in Husserl, which are in Cartesian Meditations and some of the later time consciousness lectures, more than a concern about the life world and the social character of the life world. I think Gadamer is referring to these puzzles of apodicticity when you get to this very deep level of time consciousness. That's all I was going to say. But so, Greg, go ahead.
Sorry, Greg. I just want to add a little bit. Maybe what puzzled me is because like those discussion on time, those predates the crisis. So like,
right.
It seems like Husserl has already kind of given up on, maybe it's hard to say, like, so like he has or have a new, at least Husserl had a new formulation of how this works in a crisis. So like, how come we still criticize Husserl on those previous works?
I think he was still working on those issues at the time of the crisis. I think there are signs of it. I don't know, this is a longer story. I spent a year at the Husserl archives working on these unpublished manuscripts from the mid-30s on these issues. And so I think it was still alive in his thoughts and concerns, even at the time of the crisis, even if it doesn't seem as front and center.
Yeah, and I think what I was going to say builds on that. I think that the basic problem that he's dealing with in the time consciousness stuff is still there in the crisis, and Husserl doesn't entirely solve it. That Husserl has this really great insight that, hey, our thinking is always rooted in a life world. It's a life world that gives meaning to our consciousness and our discourse. But he also still seems to think in the crisis that, like, right, all of our discourses is embedded in a particular life world, except the discourse that I'm doing right now as I write the crisis, right? There still seems to be this presuppositionless, apodictic level of philosophy that predates the life world, kind of, and now what he's saying in the crisis is kind of, hey, the first thing that we can discover presuppositionlessly is that the life world conditions everything else. And I think Gadamer wants to say, no, like, if you're going to really be consistent with this, you're going to have to see that even the crisis itself is still embedded in a life world. And you know, maybe if Husserl had lived longer, he would have, you know, untied that knot. But I think that tension is still there even in the crisis, despite the significant progress it makes.
Other
I was
thoughts?
going to say that.
Yeah.
Oh,
Wait,
just
go ahead,
real-
Eric, you raised your hand there.
I just wanted to say, like, why this matters to me is because of where it goes next in the article, right? Because toward the end of that page, only fools could see in such an ontological derivation a diminishment of the significance or legitimacy of science. So it's as if, okay, so there's this project of grounding coming from Husserl that Heidegger pulls out from under, and like Greg was just saying, if Husserl lived long enough, maybe he would have worked with this too. Okay, so this kind of, any attempt to make science grounded in a way that other interpretations of the world are not ends up failing, and so science becomes one among many options for interpretation. But it doesn't, acknowledging that doesn't diminish the significance or legitimacy of science. Am I reading that section correctly? Like, that's the point that's being made there.
So here's what I think is happening at this point in the essay. I think, you know, science, there's the rise of science. Science becomes the paradigm of knowledge in a way that maybe math played a role much earlier, or theological insights played a role for 1,000 years. And then philosophy became relegated to explaining what it is that science does right, that it works so well, and what is this knowledge, and how can we have this knowledge? So philosophy's role became like what Kant did, explain the conditions for the possibility of scientific knowledge. And this continues even through Husserl, right, to explain the possibility of scientific knowledge, and in a way that's rigorous, so that also reflects the values of science. That starts to come apart in lots of different ways. And we have in Heidegger a collapse of one whole direction to take to try to explain why it is science has the claim to knowledge it does, and then philosophy's role with respect to science. And then we get this replacement that Heidegger gives us, and he wants to say it's not a replacement that dismisses science, right? It puts science in the context of a larger life of Dasein and within these characteristics of Dasein. So now it's no longer trying to establish a legitimacy of science. it's trying to understand science in the place of our being in the world. Something like that. That's what I think is happening here. Does that make sense? Does that seem to fit? Nancy?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this might this might be a little bit off what you were just saying here, but the part that really caught my attention was on with the book on page 161. And I probably read this line over about 3 times because there was just something that I think I don't know, has some explanatory response from me, but it says the independence of science from philosophy means at the same time its irresponsibility, not in the moral sense of the word, but in the sense of its incapacity and its lack of any perceived need to give an account of what it means, what itself means within the totality of human experience, or especially in its application to nature and society. And that for me, if I could just take, you know, those 2 sentences kind of explained it all for my liking. So,
Yeah.
but it kind of didn't fit with what you were just saying, but there it is.
No, but it's important. That's I have the same thing sort of highlighted and marked.
Yeah.
Up. It seems to be a significant point.
So Nancy, just to ask for clarification on what you were just saying. So like the irresponsibility is that science doesn't have to give an account because it's obvious that what science provides us, that's the facts, those are true, whereas everything else has to legitimate itself on the basis of science or something like this.
Well, certainly, you know, within the area of nursing, that we see that with our colleague in medicine, we see that there doesn't need to be a legitimization of things because it just is. It's only us in the humanities that has to give some kind of legitimate effort around that, you know, and certainly goes back to, as it says in this essay, to Descartes and some of that. And so, yes, I would say that, you know, the playfulness around that word irresponsibility, I think, is really important.
Yeah, good. Ted, I'm gonna jump you for a second here, okay? Because we have Eddie is gonna get in here. We have someone new, okay? Eddie, go ahead. Welcome.
Good to see everyone. My name's Eddie. Nice to meet you. The only problem I'm afraid of on that irresponsibility would be when Gadamer said on page 163, but that means that today, not metaphysics, but science is dogmatically abused. And I was thinking of how the whole course or the whole point of truth and method or hermeneutics is, as we have discussed, to destroy or to leave the transcendental ideas behind. And yet we're somehow putting science as our new transcendental ground if we were to treat it irresponsibly, in the sense, as he said, we elevate science into something objective, so that it goes beyond what human experience can achieve. It is factual, it is beyond human comprehension, it is nothing to do with human experience. And then I think perhaps Gadamer was also worried about that notion where they would take something as totally grounded, transcendental, a priori, and beyond human experience as their dogmatic abuse.
Mm-hmm. And that's the sense in which science is replacing metaphysics.
Yeah.
Interesting. Ted, did you want to get back in here on this? Or we moved on from what you wanted to speak to?
Well, maybe not. Let's try. It was kind of a question directed to you, Dave, a little bit, but it seems to follow, and I appreciate the last comment. Maybe it relates to that too. But so, yeah, I mean, I guess the thought is like, let's say biology, a good biologist, insofar as they're a biologist, has to be clear or has to care about how their claims are legitimate biology. But it's not really there's nothing about those norms of making something a legitimate biology that tell you about what makes biology, the study of, and the consequences of it, legitimate for life. Okay. And I guess in Husserl, there's a kind of very radical, traditional modern grounding where you've got the sciences, and then there's a fundamental science, transcendental phenomenology. that provides the ground. And the reason you know something can be legitimate in biology ultimately, because it's legitimate down here. And we can tell whether it's a legitimate way of thinking down here and the foundations. Okay. I think Heidegger, maybe you can tell me what you think, David. It seems to me there's still that idea, like he still talks about regional ontologies, that's his name for the different sciences, and that they're in some sense grounded in answerable to fundamental ontology, so that the way you would know whether a claim in biology is legitimate beyond its role in biology is whether it's something we would resolutely decide for in our existence, something like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it would have to be, it's a different sense of legitimate. Is that fair?
Yeah,
Right. We're
yeah.
asking what makes a legitimate. We're asking a very different kind of question. And so then it's a different sense of grounding.
Right.
But I see the parallels, right?
And then for me, the question is, what does Gadamer do? Like I think he basically agrees with Heidegger that there's a really different way of thinking about the grounding. It has to answer to the meaning of our existence. But you know, for Gadamer, that's a very social historical endeavor, whereas for Heidegger, it's pretty ultimately, the early Heidegger, pretty ultimately individuating experience of our relation to our death that drives it.
Right, right. And doesn't this connect to Nancy's concern then? When we ask
Yeah.
about the legitimacy of it, science doesn't answer that question. And then
Yeah.
as a result, science doesn't have to be responsible to its larger role. And maybe also to what Eddie pointed to with this idea that science by its very nature ignores those questions. It's not just coincidental that it isn't responsible for those things. It's by its very nature, it suggests we are the only answer you will ever need.
There's nothing about the norms of biology that guarantee what counts as true or important or whatever in biology is going to be true or important or whatever for life.
Yeah, exactly. But part of the norm biology is to say this is where the knowledge lies.
Yeah,
Biology.
that's right, and that's the challenge. I think what Nancy's pointing out to, like, wait a minute, why?
Yeah.
Why do they get that pretense for free?
Yeah, and I think to what Eddie says about being the new dogmatism.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I mean, thanks.
No, okay. All right, we'll get back to everybody else now. All right, let's do Greg. Greg, go ahead, and then Don, then Eric.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up to that. Doesn't Ian Thompson have a book, the kind of main gist of which is that, yeah, Heidegger early on is engaged in precisely this, let's dole out all the different Wissenschaften in terms of these regional ontologies. And that's like what's undergirding his ideas, when he's rector, about how we're going to, reform the German university around this investigation into being. But then I think Thompson argues that idea that you can kind of divvy up the sciences that way is one of the things that Heidegger's moving away from in the later work. So maybe if Thompson's right about that, and I'm not in a position to know whether that's the case or not, but maybe that would be a point on which Heidegger or Gadamer would be following the later rather than the early Heidegger.
Yeah, makes sense. Don?
I hesitate to intervene in this extraordinarily illuminating and very high level discussion, which I have appreciated so much. I mean, it really has clarified this for me in a wonderful way, and thank everybody for that. I just wanted to mention the beginning essay in the book chimes with the ending essay in the book. They are, in a sense, two versions of the same line of thought. One with reference to specific figures in the history of philosophy, the other one in a more general way. But he makes a remark in that earlier essay. This is on page 14 of the book, Reason in the Age of Science. He speaks in the case of physics, contemporary physics, about statistics, the role of statistics in physics. And he speaks of new models of self-consciousness come to the fore in contrast to mechanics and power-driven machines. And I think he's trying to say there that the newest modes of physics, sort of quantum mechanics and things of that kind, change the way in which science thinks about itself. And the very irresponsibility of science may have to be abandoned because of the way science is coming to think of itself as itself included in the very processes it is examining, so that self-reflection has to become part of it. Now, that I just mention that for what it's worth. I don't want to derail the discussion because this is, so please go right on, but I thought that might possibly be relevant.
Yeah. Eric.
This connects more with Nancy and others, but Don, I think it can connect with what you were just saying too. I'm just gonna put my hand on. Who are they, right? Like the other side of what happens is once science is like metaphysics and becomes dogmatic, then they become the ones who ask others to legitimate themselves, right? So I think that connects with the reference to Thompson's book with the rest of the title of the book is The Technology and the Politics of Education. I mean, that's exactly it, right? Where it's well, now, in as much as science has become the dogmatic norm, everything else is having to legitimate itself in light of that. And it's who are they to ask us to legitimate ourselves when they're not even doing it?
Yeah, good. Yes, Eddie.
As a short note, not to interrupt anyone, in fact, isn't the whole purpose of truth and method asking us to legitimate everything for ourselves, to put the human experience, the intersubjectivity before all these other legitimizations like science or physics or whatever? Isn't that the whole point of Gadamer? And that if we were to be legitimized by science, what doesn't it simply mean that we're trying to submit in front of another deity like we did in the Middle Ages, where we used to embrace fully to church and the Pope? Now we're just finding another substitution called science, but it is not essentially different from submission. Am I making myself?
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. I'm hesitant, others can speak this too. I'm hesitant to say the one point of truth and method, but it's because it's so big. But I certainly think he's concerned about features of science, certainly the reliance on method, on nominalism, on the ways it seems to give us a kind of idea of rationality that suggests this is all there is to say. And he's concerned about what gets lost if science's relation to tradition, a rejection of tradition, what gets lost if science becomes a paradigm of the way we understand knowledge and the way we understand ourselves in the world. So I think that's certainly one of the main threads of truth and method, is what gets lost if we focus on these aspects of science. Does that make sense? Yeah. Kate.
Hello, I'm not sure if this is a deviation from the conversation a little bit, but I also had that quote highlighted that Nancy had mentioned, and thinking that because science is so privileged, it almost needs to legitimize itself more, because it's the fact that it's considered obviously right all the time is dangerous when you have irresponsible scientists and you have irresponsible, publications or journals where, we have anti-vaxxers who believe that vaccines cause autism because one study in a respected journal said it did when they weren't actually doing responsible science. And that just had, very serious ramifications for society and health. That, if science had to maybe work a little bit harder to establish itself as this is a legitimate claim, or question it a little bit more, we might not be in this situation.
Yeah, great. John, before I call on you, can I ask a question? Kate, this is for you and maybe for Nancy too. I mean, the way you put it, doesn't it sound like it's a moral irresponsibility? I mean, he wants to say it's not moral, but it seems like you've given great examples of why there is a moral responsibility. for science, that it's not thinking about the ways in which it holds all the answers to all the questions. What do you think?
I think there is a moral responsibility because people follow it, and
Right.
and people take the results from science and use it in people's lives in a way that you might not with philosophy. Like you might choose a certain treatment for someone based on one study, thinking that it's going to work in every situation. And just the way that science kind of unfolds, I think there's so much taken for granted that, you know, you just take it as right. I think I'm kind of rambling now, but so many people take it up as fact. But then one week you have, you know, coffee shortens your life, and then the next week coffee lengthens your life. So science is changing all the time, and I think people lose sight of that fact too. And the way that you do science will affect the results that you have. So, you know, that without having that kind of in-depth knowledge in the general public, I think science needs to do a really good job of explaining itself and saying that, you know, this isn't, you know, this coffee isn't going to lengthen life for everybody, but in this group it did.
Right.
Just to kind of contextualize what you're doing in an experiment or what you're doing in a study in a way that makes people think critically about it rather than just take it as fact.
Yeah.
But I think if I can just jump in, and I'm sorry, I see that there's hands up. I think philosophy also has a moral responsibility in the same way. And it can't just get away with saying it doesn't. And so, like, for me, it's kind of both and you know, I know, you know, I'm teaching advanced doctoral level qualitative research course right now. And one of the discussions, Angela is here and she's in that course, that we're having a lot of is our moral responsibility to answer the questions that we're supposed to be answering, not just to say that we can say whatever we want. So I'd say both.
Yeah, great, thanks. I got the sense you were saying more than what Gadamer was saying in this quote. John Arthos.
Yeah, so I wanted to pick up on Eddie's question. You know, you know, the whether or not, you know, it's the point that Gadamer is making. This essay is a version of one of his great polemical, you know, argument, philosophy or theory of science. So, you know, he thinks about this as the modernity as the age of science, and so I think that he's talking about philosophy not just in the Heideggerian sense, but in the sense of Aristotelian phronesis, of the long prudential tradition, which he actually thinks, as Eddie said, should be the guiding mode of understanding rather than, you know, apodictic knowledge, a priori knowledge, the transparent consciousness and so forth, right? So I wanted to sort of broaden this, broaden the question out much further and ask a relevance question, because I put a link in the chat earlier to this thing that's going on now. If people are not aware of GPT and the ways in which, you know, the logic of the algorithm is, you know, taking over, and Chat GPT is this amazing, this like revolutionary new technology that's based on predictive logic, right? Which is these machines, these computers can only make a judgment based upon, you know, they're predicting the next word in a sentence is all they're doing, right? They're summing the mass of data that's available to them. And it's exactly the type of reasoning, scientific reasoning, that if you want someone who has a better answer to that than Gadamer, I don't know who it is, right? You know, with his notion of experience that Eddie's referring to. So my question is this: why isn't Gadamer now sort of the prophet of our age? Right? Why don't we hear about him all the time as the person who really does have the best answer to the threat of social engineering and the regime of the expert and the society of technique? and the status privilege of, science with a capital S and method and all of that. I mean, what, so I guess I'm asking, I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but I'd like to know why we don't hear about him more, referenced more in response to this particular question that's really has seized us now.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, John. I'm gonna bookmark that question and we'll come back to it because I want to know if I want to make sure that John and Henry have something on the thread. They have a chance to speak to it. So John Beach.
Sure, just to briefly speak to what John Arthos said, my quick answer, although it's not meant to be smart, is that Gadamer is just a little too difficult because we haven't caught up to him yet. That's why we're not reading him, because he's just a little bit ahead of everybody else. But going back to the thing about science, and this is, I mean, let me refer to page 15 where it said, nevertheless, precisely this situation of the self-crucifying subjectivism of modernity seems to me to lend significance to another dimension, making life, whatever. But the thing is, everything is put at our disposal. Reality, it's a basic ontological thing that, in other words, nature, what really is seen as our sort of, sort of in our control and in our sphere of domination. And that's based on that's based on our very deepest ontological presuppositions about what is and what we really are, how to really speak about it truthfully. And this is what Gadamer is attacking. And so eventually, sure, it's an ethical thing ultimately, but it's just to say he's attacking this sort of hegemony of science, is the word he uses in the first essay, where it controls all knowledge of is, and truthfully, and of course, modern problem is that modern classical scholarship, everybody that teaches it in a freaking university, they believe that. They believe that all truth comes from science. They even explicitly say that, even some of their greatest scholars. And anybody that doesn't know that shouldn't be in teaching at a university. Greek philosophy is totally outside of that. It all starts in, it's a modern approach to it. But you can't get it by reading Gadamer about Greek philosophy. You got to read all the Greek philosophers themselves. Anyway, so I think Gadamer does have the idea, does have the solution, does have the way to solve our sort of self-crucifixion. And but I think he's just a little too difficult for us to catch up to at this point. That's my.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, John.
I'm gonna stick with it too.
Want to turn back a little bit to what was talk about the irresponsibility of science, like whether it's moral or not. But I want to speak first to the irresponsibility. It I don't want to sound like a fanboy of Rousseau, but it sounds very much like for example, in Origin of Geometry, how there is how science or mathematics forgets its origin in the life world, of how it forgot it was originally grounded in a more Umwelt, a more original shared experience. And speaking of that, even in the first page of this essay, he references the rigorous science. He mentioned how philosophy should be the rigorous science. It seems like a pretty ostentatious reference to Rousseau's article of the same name. And so this kind of irresponsibility of the science is linked to how it forgot that it was originally a part of some bigger part. But I agree with Gadamer that this kind of irresponsibility is not a moral kind, because we are talking about in this sense science or philosophy as principle of how to study something. Like they are not humans, right? It's just set of principles, set of rules. Like we can criticize science as Husserl did, as like a inconsistent or cannot be self-justified set of rules, but like it's not a moral kind of thing. It's a wrong kind of category. When we talk about like the responsibility of science, usually we're talking about the scientists, right? But scientists are not just practicing strictly the principle of science. Like there are many things at the same time, right? But often they forget about like what they are, or maybe they overstep their expertise, like as in like, oh, okay, I'm doing science, but they will make claims that might not follow exactly the principles of science. And here's where the two links together, right? Since science forgot its own history of how it developed its principles, it is even more murky to the people who practice science to know like where the groundings are. Like they believe they had a grounding in some principles, in believing those principles had a solid ground, but like maybe it's just all a house of cards that all of it can just fall down without any I don't know. So here's the place where the rigorous science part has to come in. Like, so philosophy as a rigorous science, Husserl's project was to ground everything in a very mystical transcendental ego, but Gadamer kind of, I feel like at least in this article, want to take up that project, but instead of grounding it in that transcendental ego, he wants to ground it in something else. Does that make sense?
I was with you until he wants to ground it in something else, as opposed to eliminate the grounding project altogether. Is that okay?
Okay, yeah, maybe. Yeah, I wasn't clear on the last part neither. Sorry.
But yeah, absolutely, it makes sense. And I think in some ways I mean, to the extent you talk about the authority of science that sustains itself because of its forgetfulness, its ability to forget its origins and forget its legitimation, is what also can lead to people, not just in their scientific role, but to exceed their role as a scientist and maybe present ideas inappropriately and lead people astray because of it. So that's how you see these things really are somewhat connected. Is that fair? Yeah, I think it makes sense. Don?
I just want to say I appreciate John Arthos' question, and I'm not being flip. I'm being serious when I say that a philosopher is without honor in his own country. So in a way, it's not surprising that Gadamer is not being attended to. In reflections on my philosophical journey in the volume, The Library of Living Philosophers, where on Gadamer, on page 41, he remarks about truth and method that he now feels that he was making too sharp a distinction between the humanities, as we might call it, and science. And that science was more complicated than he had thought it was. And the relation between those two is more complicated than he thought it was. And he pursues that here in bringing in Popper and Wittgenstein and Kuhn and so on. And he is specifically extracting from them a hermeneutic dimension in the understanding of science. And that means that he is coming to see that that there's a difference between treating science as this self-justified thing and discovering within itself a hermeneutic dimension. Okay, and that hermeneutic dimension would allow science to understand its own limitations. Okay, that doesn't mean that science therefore must now take up social questions, because he thinks that it's philosophy that has the traditional focus on the totality, on the whole. And so at the end of the essay on page 167, he says that science does not lose any of its legitimacy and status if it acknowledges that the humaniora have an integrative function, which the sciences do not have. I mean, in this book, on page 3, in the earlier essay, he says, does there ultimately reside in the solidarity that unites all the speakers of a language something about whose content and structure one can inquire, and concerning which no science is capable of even asking a question? Okay, and I think he means that, and he wants to say that the sciences do not lose any of their legitimacy when they recognize this hermeneutic dimension in themselves, when they recognize this self-limitation. But when that happens, are we talking about theory of science, or are we talking about philosophy? And he leaves that as a question. At that point, the opposition between philosophy and the theory of science, in a sense, I'm not sure I would say dissolves, but it becomes much more complicated. And now science itself has a hermeneutic dimension, and therefore points to the legitimacy of hermeneutic reflection on the solidarity of language that underlies our whole experience, and within which science fits itself into the human world we live in. Yeah. Okay, I'll just stop there.
Wow. Okay, that was an impressive sum up of what happens in the last 4 pages. I really want to turn to that next. John Arthos, did you want to follow up briefly, and then Eddie,
Yeah,
we close off this first part, and we'll move to that last section.
Yeah. And so Don, I wanted to ask you because, well, yeah, so Gadamer is very sensitive because he's had all of these attacks. And so he wants to clarify that he's not trying to badmouth science, right? He's trying to say it's relative location or relative to phronesis. So and Don, I mean, Joel, your co-translator or co-translator reviser, this was one of his points very early on. He has this wonderful section in the book about that Gadamer was in fact oversimplifying when he used method in the singular, right? He's developing that idea. But I've never had a chance to ask you, because I never talked with Joel about that point. You know, he I think somewhere else he even uses the word sort of anachronistic at a certain point. Gadamer's notion of method was already anachronistic by the time he published it in 1960. So I mean, did he catch on to that idea a little bit sooner than everybody else? What is your sense of his view of that?
I'm not sure I've got a good answer to that. I'm not going to speak for Joel. You know, okay. He says the reflections on my journey that he was already aware in the 30s of the limitations of protocol sentences, and he was aware of this from an article by Moritz Schlick, who sort of critiqued them. And so I think he's trying to say that, well, I kind of had a hint of this early on, okay, but I didn't digest it thoroughly. And so it was only later when I came to, I mean, Kuhn obviously hadn't written Even When Truth and Method. He couldn't have heard about Kuhn, okay. And I think he only gradually began to appreciate the depth of Popper, but he held back from Popper because it was not just falsification that he was after. He certainly thought falsification changed the way we think about science, okay? But his critique of Popper is that the real heart of research, what makes it fruitful, is not falsification, but questions, asking fruitful questions, okay? And the falsification needs to be understood within the context of asking fruitful questions. I think it's really here that he's very clear later. He's very clear about this emergent hermeneutic dimension in science that has emerged from science itself. Okay, so I think he himself says he was too rigid in Truth and Method, and I think, you know, I still think it's a great book. I mean, I'm not trying to badmouth Gadamer here, but I think he came to see that science, in a sense, confirmed what he was saying. It didn't contradict. It wasn't a conflict. It confirmed what he was saying. And it showed, science itself showed that we are located inside the solidarity of language primordially, and science has to fit within that. He does say in the first essay, actually, science doesn't do a very good job of fitting within that. Metaphysics actually did a better job of organizing the solidarities of our social existence. Okay, so he's very worried about science. And he's sort of saying, if we do not get a grip on science and come to understand it and its limitations and accept them, it is going to kill us. So, yeah.
Okay, good. Eddie, go ahead.
Audio.
Sorry. I'll try to reply to Dr. John Arnold and Dr. Marshall at the same time. So I'm not sure this would would not be a crazy statement to make, but the precise reason why Gadamer has been underappreciated, as I see it, is because nobody in this world, or fewer and fewer of us, are engaged with the fusion of horizon, in the sense that a lot of us stopped thinking, stopped contemplating, stopped looking for truth and answers. Instead, they turn into Philistinism, which is tragic because that is exactly what Gadamer would say. Those are the people who do not open up their horizons, but remain unclosed to whatever suggestions they have. So that is the reason, Dr. Arnold, I think that Gadamer, along with many other thinkers, are underappreciated today, commonly. And then to Dr. Marshall, I was actually thinking about how that killing of ourselves would take place, how we will ultimately eradicate ourselves. And then my conclusion was, it is not a Matrix scenario, or it is not those world-ending catastrophic movies. In fact, the way we kill ourselves is to alienate ourselves, so that we no longer see ourselves as human beings. We no longer see our experience as the human experience. We simply treat ourselves in a Kantian sense as means and not ends. And then by doing so, we ultimately dehumanize ourselves so that we become extinct, because we are no longer human, so we cannot talk about the human experience. Hopefully that doesn't sound insane.
No, that's great. Thanks. I've got John and Tom. I want to move on, turn the page to 164, 165 at least, so we can talk about what Gadamer calls the hermeneutic movements in the direction of de-dogmatization of science, which Don's already talked about. Okay, go ahead, John Beach.
Yes, perfect. That's what I was going to point to, was page 165, which in Gadamer's sort of language, it's kind of meta, and it kind of skips over a lot of things that he's saying. But he talks about after he talks about Popper, he talks about rationality, and in respect to a pre-given purpose. It's precisely the pre-givenness of our ends, the whole buildup of the common purposive directions of social existence that underpins practical rationality, and is confirmed, blah, 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 and the norms of social conduct that determine us. In this manner, too, practical rationality has to make use of the manipulative possibilities with respect to the world of means placed at our disposal by science. In a sense, and Gadamer said this elsewhere, we presume that the ends are self-evident. It's be efficient, make the most money, make society most organized. We don't even question those as so. But here he's saying that science puts all of our capacity for practical ethical thinking on that track, on that technological track that Heidegger speaks of, and basically we've got to break out of that. Like it's talks about de-dogmatization and so on, and what Don and John Arthos were talking about But I think it's inherent in our sort of the modern subjectivism that is this self-crucifying subjectivism that we still haven't broken out of philosophically. And that's why practical philosophy, we don't see it the way we should see it yet. Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
And that is that we need to start asking more questions about the ends rather than just simply focusing on the
Oh yeah,
means.
we're not capable of that.
Right.
The basic sort of essence and truth of science is that everything is for us to manipulate and control. We can figure out what the ends are. They're pretty self-evident, and we've already got that. So it's just not even brought into question. There's no, science doesn't give us any potential to even question or ask these questions. In fact, they don't even recognize these as legitimate questions.
Yeah, good. Yeah, Tom. Tom, if you have your mute.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to get myself off mute, and I'm also trying to suss out if my point has passed, because I was just digesting what John Beach was saying, which is very interesting. I suppose one of my concerns in the kind of de-dogmatization account in perhaps more the way with this, I mean, it's not a criticism of discussion at all. The discussion's super interesting, but we keep referring to this science as quite a sort of closed bounded thing. In the same way that often when Gadamer writes, he kind of channels everything through names, you know, so we've got Popper and we've got Kuhn and we've got, you know, and they sort of stand for big things. And when Eddie was just saying about that, you know, that we don't do fusion of horizons anymore and we don't do all that sort of stuff. My sort of wariness is we kind of fall back into commonplaces that cement these situations rather than lead towards greater understanding or greater understanding of ends. Because if we're working with quite blunt tools, I mean, necessary for our conversation, because we're not, you know, we don't want to get into the fine details of particle physics, because like who wants to do that on a Sunday, right? But at the same time, I guess my concern is, you know, well, I'll say with a quote on the last on page 166. Gadamer says at the end of the first paragraph, this is the linguistic constitution of our human life, which can be neither replaced nor repressed by any information techniques, which I thought was fantastic quote. And then I thought, but is that right? Because information techniques are pretty huge, right? And it's something that combines scientific insight with economic activity, with neoliberal marketization, with semio-capital, you know, all this kind of stuff. And actually the proliferation of information it is aimed at removing interpretation, removing fusions of horizons, like Eddie was saying, but it also disrupts some of those sort of commonplace figures that we might want to pull up in these accounts. So I guess my, you know, I really like what the piece is saying, but I'm always at the same time aware, are we talking sort of 20 years behind what's actually happening, particularly in terms of information, because that seems to be so sort of crucial. And you know, you look at the sort of movements in health data science and behavioral insights and all this kind of stuff, which is absolutely dominate. You know, health funders are so excited by this stuff because it will give us answers straight away. It will get us to the end straight away. Because and it removes the so it's like on the one hand it's absolutely what Gadamer's talking to, but on the other hand it seems to be much more than just sort of dogma and much more than power. It seems to have a lot more depth and spread than perhaps was in the targets of Gadamer.
Yeah, John Arthos. Yeah, thanks, Tom.
Yeah, like Tom, that's a really important. I try to respond to that. I mean, I think it's really, really important to acknowledge what you just said, So I teach at the undergraduate level. I basically teach, public speaking and argumentation from a Gadamerian perspective. But the students are not inclined, undergraduates are not inclined to pay close enough attention to evidence and citation and strong warrants for their arguments and providing good reasons and using all of the big data that's available. And that's really, really important to oppose, as you say, dogma and prejudice, right? So I think that the way that comes in for Gadamer, because if you're talking about commonplace wisdom, you're always in danger of another kind of dogmatism, the dogmatism of the norm, of the sensus communis, right? So the place where that comes in for me, that's so important in Gadamer's notion of hermeneutic understanding is, he says you have to start off with a common sense understanding, but then you're pulled up short by someone challenging you or a text that reveals the weakness in your presuppositions. And that's where, for instance, data, any scientific testing, all of that stuff comes in at that point to throw you back on your feet when you realize, oh yeah, I may have a very narrow perspective and I need, that needs to be corrected. So that's where I would say it comes in.
Tom, do you want to respond to that?
No, I think that's
good.
I mean, I agree with John. I think there's something about the sort of contemporary development of information, and that's why I'm interested that Gadamer uses that, focuses on that at the end, and in two ways. One is that when we talk about the challenge to our presuppositions, one might argue there's so many challenges, there's so much information that it makes it difficult to pick through. But then at the same time, that kind of becomes a commonplace as well. I've always critical of this idea that we continue to use, massive information that overwhelms us and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not particularly convinced that does happen. I think that's kind of an easy way of separating. I think it falls into the old metaphors of reason and unreason as, water and land and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, other than that, I agree with what John was saying.
Okay, great. Jim.
I don't understand the last thing that Tom said about reason and unreason. My understanding of what Gadamer is saying is he says information technique. So the contrast is, I'll come back to Gadamer in just a second. To me, the contrast is with what Arendt calls the lack of thinking. I mean, it's a question, we have so much information. It's not what science is doing, and we have information about science, and we're not sure, going back to Katie Wong's comment about how misinterpret surveys or something from science could be statistically an error, factually even an error, and there's still people buying it. That's the onus then comes on us, not necessarily science. And that's the same with information. It's a question of what we do with that. So Arendt's point is that we fail to think in this age anymore, whether it's about science or media or anything. And so what Arendt, I think, means by thinking, to get back to Gadamer, is precisely the experience of understanding. So there's no discernment, there's no discrimination, and that's at the heart of the experience of understanding that requires the effort of our thinking.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jim. Don?
Well, I think Tom is just right on target, and John, and these other comments and Jim's comments are very helpful. Gadamer is almost exactly 20 years behind where we are, because he died in 2004. So I guess we have a job in front of us. We really can't expect him to do everything for us, But to John's point, I thought it is, Gadamer makes a point dialectic in Plato, and that is the discovery that giving an account that is justifying the rightness of what you do can't rest on the tyrannies of the commonplace. You have to break through the commonplace. You have to get free of those and find a different grounding for them. I mean, Plato does think about grounding and so forth, but Gadamer might not. But I think Gadamer does want us to get beyond the commonplace of the sensus communis, sort of kind of taken for granted of it, and get us a little further on. And that requires thinking. And thinking is never, well, I don't mean to be cynical, but thinking is not something which is universally appreciated. Okay.
Thanks, John. It struck me that one thing that's happening in this paragraph is on the bottom of 165 to 166 that we're focusing on. Gadamer has talked about, what I detected was three things. Don's mentioned all these already. One is the importance of questions and raising the right kind of question. And he thinks this is a hermeneutic issue. One is that any form of making statements requires an understanding that takes seriously the scope. And that's a hermeneutic issue. And then the third one is what John Beach was talking about, concerns about ends, not means. And these are all three ways. I think he was saying these are three ways in which we show the ways in which science has these hermeneutic elements shot through with hermeneutic concerns. And then what I took him to be doing in this paragraph is saying, well, the opening sentence is, at any rate, one has to ask oneself here whether all these movements in the direction of de-dogmatization, inasmuch as they have been understood by logical empiricism itself as a theory of science, or as a mere expansion of scientific modes of procedure, are not subordinated to an instrumental ideal of knowledge. And then he talks about linguistic analysis. So I can imagine somebody taking all this information and saying, well, what we need to do then is refine our language. We need to get our terms better. We need to remove all the sorts of things that logical positivists tried to do. We need to perfect the way we talk and speak and nail down our definitions and eliminate these ambiguities. So it's entirely clear at every moment what exactly somebody is saying and what they are claiming and what the question specifies. And that's what I understood him by saying, then he appeals to Wittgenstein in the life world of language, right, the language games, and says we're never going to solve these problems by simply using linguistic techniques, by doing a sort of linguistic analysis, by turning language itself into a sort of science and applying our scientific techniques to language, that language is first and foremost what we live. That's what I sort of, more narrowly thought what was going on in this paragraph. But of course, at the same time, it's bringing up all these other great issues. Yes, Eric.
In relation to that, right after that, he says this phrase, and I wanted to know why he especially emphasizes it, because going into the next page, right, that same paragraph of the de-dogmatization, instrumentalization, that stuff, he says, where's the sentence? Okay. The process and content of coming to agreement, even to the point of the buildup of a common world in which we speak an understandable, and then he has the hyphens, right? No, not just understandable, the same language with one another. Why does he emphasize it's not just understandable, it's the same language? And that in that context of actually speaking the same language, that's when we can start to put all of these pieces in place into the whole.
Yeah, it's exactly the same in German, so we can't blame it on the translation. Yeah, John Beach.
Okay, and maybe Jim will say the same thing. I think he's referring to Platonic dialectic here. And that's what happens in dialectic is that the interlocutors do eventually start to speak the same language. And yeah, and I would say Heidegger once said, philosophy has no information to give out. I think that's true. and finally, I would just say that all this stuff about, I mean, information doesn't really tell us. It's still an instrumental. It's still we're the controller. We're in charge. It's us to decide what's real and what isn't. It doesn't. All the information in the world isn't going to change that, or isn't going to help us with that problem. That the scientific stuff, scientific sort of challenges with. Okay, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, good. Jim. You might be muted, Jim.
Yes, I have a variation on that. John started with Platonic dialogue. So I'd say with the same language, the better word for me is the common language. So again, I'll appeal to Arendt. We have to be in common in order to see differences, to grasp the other in their difference. And Gadamer maintains the same idea. So we can't have a genuine conversation with another unless we begin in our conversations to find a common language by which we then can go to the real issue of understanding. I think it's a poor choice of word on Gadamer's part, just use same language.
Yeah, Don.
Well, I agree with that. I think those are both very, very helpful comments. Is it possible that what he's thinking of here is the stress he puts on linguisticality, not just a Sprache, not just a language, but linguisticality itself, Sprachlichkeit itself. And that is what constitutes human beings, is linguisticality. I mean, at some points, he insists on linguisticality as and exactly how what linguisticality means apart from any particular language is a bit mysterious to me. I mean, I don't think I understand it, but so I'm just, is he thinking of that here when he says, no, the same language? That is, linguisticality is what is fundamental to human beings. Even if you speak German and I speak Russian and somebody else speaks Chinese, linguisticality is still common to all of us.
Yeah, Henry, on that, or on Jim's or John's points.
I wanted to add a bit before saying that James, or was it Don Marshall's point, reminds me of like the linguisticality is maybe related to interpret method, where it's like being that can be expressed is language. I forgot what exactly the quote was, but like there's a close line, the link between being and language for Gadamer. But the question I wanted to ask before is on like if the process of the language is to come up to this common world, how is this different from the ground that he is trying to criticize? Like linguisticality is a more conceptual thing, but it's still some kind of grounding for common understanding, is it not? So I'm trying to figure out what is the difference.
And just to add to that, the very next sentence is, thus we see shown forth in the sciences themselves a hermeneutic dimension as a properly sustaining and grounding factor. All right.
Right on.
All right. So you put that on the table. Greg, go ahead.
I think the timing does not bear this out as like what Gadamer had in mind. I just want to, the claim that no, it's not about sharing a common language, but just about speaking a language that the interlocutor can understand is like the one criticism that Davidson explicitly levels at Gadamer in that essay on Gadamer and the Philebus. So the first thought I had when I read that is, oh, maybe Gadamer has like he's like, rejoining to this, like, no, Davidson, I meant what I said. It's a common language, not just understanding. But I can't. I was scrolling around trying to find the timing of when those essays came out, whether this was before or after that, and I suspect this was before. But I just thought it was interesting. That was the one place that Davidson kind of pushes on him explicitly.
So Greg, what about Jim's suggestion that Gadamer should have said common, not same? That loosens it up a little bit and.
Yeah,
So makes the
maybe,
point.
although I think that for Gadamer, it's going to be important that common and same kind of mean the same thing, in the sense that there's no sense to be made of the idea of two people speaking the same language apart from them having a common language. So I would want to read that as in the same way that, like Wittgenstein wants to say, look, the idea of absolute sameness, absolute exactness, like that doesn't make any sense, right? We can say that things are the same, and what we mean is that they're, sorry, Caleb just came. Hi, Caleb. What we mean is they have, this kind of relevant commonality, that's he's leaning on that this is just what it means to speak the same language.
Okay. Ted.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on this too. Some things I've been thinking about language. I think they're right, but I'm not sure why, because it doesn't seem to make sense for Gadamer yet. But, I mean, in this sentence, it's emphasized that okay, so I think we have a prejudice that a language means a national language, and that linguisticality is somehow the character of language that each of the languages has. But it's not obvious to me that when Gadamer talks about language, Sprache, he means a national language, or at least not originally. It may be that in some derivative way, the language we speak is German or English, but I think he thinks there's something much more fundamental going on, namely that a certain horizon or a certain network of possible meanings and shared common ways of thinking about things have emerged in the process of the transmission of meaning historically in language, so that whatever language is the one that we've built up in our interactions. It's not the case that doesn't turn out to be a German or an English a lot of the time, though of course, like with Lisant, we can say it could turn out to be a Creole. But I think what he's trying to say is that it's not as if there's some substantive given national language ahead of time that then we either share or don't. Whatever we're able to communicate, that's the language that we have in common, or the same language. So in other words, I think that if I've got you, Jim, in this, I don't know if it's a criticism or not, but the worry about using the word same language derives from a prejudice about the idea that a language means a national language. I think maybe with Greg, a common language is whichever one we've built up together, thanks to our shared participation in meaning, the transmission of meaning. And to say that it's the same and common then really amounts to the same thing. Something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm kind of getting interested in a tendency that Gadamer seems to have later. Like in in Truth and Method, he really seems to, when he's talking about a language, he really seems to think he means a national language. But as he moves forward in part 3 there, and then in later essays, and then when he takes up themes like translation, he seems to think about language a little bit more expansively than in the kind of classical German idealistic or romantic framework that he inherits and that he's trying to escape from the beginning. Something like that.
Yeah, good. Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, I agree with Ted. In part, that difference that Gadamer might have is because the world's becoming more global as Gadamer got older, and so that could be a reason for him recognizing so much the diversity of the world. But to Greg's point about the sameness, yeah, I only meant to use, I still think common's a better word, but Heidegger makes a difference between sameness and identity, but a lot of people don't. So if you say the word sameness, sometimes you get that, you assume it means something like something that is identical. And that's clearly not the sense of it. But I thought the way Ted was also speaking helps clarify the other question about the difference between the finding a common language as a basis and the whole idea of the theoretical basis. And I think Ted answered that in his comments, and I want to make it clear by saying the task in a dialogue is always to find the common in order to proceed. So that's clearly a different basis than a transcendental basis, which proceeding, which is a kind of a given by which everything then is related to, or everything arises from it as if it's has the character of an arche. And that's not the basis of the linguistic basis of our communicative understanding. It's not an arche. It's more, then it becomes the medium, the place, you might say. It's a place in that richer sense.
Greg, I know you have your hand up, but just like the shortest thing. Yeah, I mean, you know, the Tower of Babel is in the future. That is like we're kind of moving toward a broader and broader possibility to speak together. It's not an arche as much as it's a teles kind of.
All right, Greg.
Yeah, I agree 100% with what Ted said earlier. I thought that was nicely put, and I think you can even like take the point maybe a step further, that part of what Gadamer's especially in the later work getting at the realization that even the idea of a national language is kind of an abstraction, right? We're used to thinking, there's some answer to the question, what does the word principle mean in English? And there is no answer, right? What that word means is always going to be geared to the particular situation in which you're using it, right? Every word kind of takes on its own flavor of meaning in each particular conversation we have. So insofar as we think of language as, a repository of meaning, even talking about the English language or the German language is already kind of an abstraction that gets away from where the real locus of meaning is, which is in, as you were saying, the particular conversations.
Okay, good. I want to take up Henry's question. I think one way of formulating too is hasn't Gadamer given us a model of philosophy's relation to the sciences in just the kind of way suggesting we shouldn't do? That is, he is stating here what his philosophy has done is show the way the sciences are dependent upon a linguistic shared common world, which establishes certain sorts of activities as meaningful, a kind of life world, and others not. And so he's given us just the kind of view about the relation between science and philosophy that it seems like he was reacting against early on, that philosophy lays out the conditions for the functioning of science and understand science's place and what it does well and what it doesn't do well. And Henry asked whether this whole conversation about language now just amounts to a new version of grounding. Is that fair, Henry? Yeah, what do people think about that? Yes, Ted.
I won't talk as long as but I think that maybe the thing we were talking about earlier, David, that you pointed out and something I was saying is the master key. I don't think the question is about escaping the question of ground, but radically re-understanding what it would mean to ground something. There's an account here that allows us to understand that there really is a ground of the sciences, namely our common understanding of the world as we pass it down historically in language through events of understanding. But once we understand that, we see that it's a radically different way of thinking about what a ground is than what Husserl had originally intended, or other, neo-Kantians or Descartes, anybody in modernity. So, not anybody, but you know what I mean. So, yeah, I'm not sure that Gadamer is so averse to the project of science and the project of grounding. After all, the book Truth and Method is supposed to be about the validity of a certain experience of truth. The goal of the book is to clarify the scope, limits, and validity of a certain experience of truth. It's to ground it, to clarify its validity. But I think that the thing is that he's kind of following Heidegger's great gesture of understanding that once we introduce certain problems, then we have to rethink what grounding means. And then, this is a theory of science, I guess, that he's giving, but one where you have to radically understand what science means and what it means to ground it, something like that.
Yeah. Okay, great. Eric.
Yeah, Ted, that is along the lines of what I'm so glad you said that, because it goes back for me to the original question I was asking about transcendental, ontological, right? So we could start to distinguish different kinds of grounding, and that it's not the kind of grounding that he's proposing with common ground is not the kind of grounding that Husserl's after with a transcend. I'm not going to say transcendental, a transcendent ground.
Okay. Yeah. John Beach?
Yeah, just like to concur with all of this, especially with what Ted was saying and also with what Eric was saying, but we shouldn't be afraid of using the word ground. Gadamer is never afraid of it, nor is Heidegger. And it just because, we had this big thing called anti-foundationalism that, and pragmatism and all this stuff that supposedly overcame modern subjectivism, which it doesn't even touch. We should, in my humble opinion, that we should, as Eric says, like there's different kinds of grounds. There's the transcendental, there's the subjectivism of Husserl, which is a ground. But nevertheless, language itself, linguisticality can be a ground. And if you look in the way the writings of Plato and Aristotle, that is their ground, is linguisticality. They don't, like Aristotle never goes outside of language and he uses the spoken language, that's the common language, but they turn it into sort of a philosophical terms. That's where they all originated from. And then the Platonic dialectic, and that's basically Gadamer, where it keeps going back to in the Phaedo, to the turn to the logoi. That's what that means. That's all. It means that how do we talk about it? How do we speak about it? And then Aristotle always works from that back to the principles, and it's only individual things. But anyway, that's enough of that. But it's all clearly illustrated in Greek philosophy. You just see it happening in real time. You just read a Greek text or yeah.
So there's a long history of thinking about ground in this different sense, going all the way
Well,
back.
you can see that language is the ground for Plato and Aristotle. There it is. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Greg.
Yeah, just to build on that idea, I was going to suggest that one of the ways in which the Gadamerian sense of grounding differs maybe from some of the older senses is that grounding for Gadamer is this kind of this project that's constantly being renewed, as opposed, like for Kant, okay, we ground the natural sciences in the first critique. Okay, now we've established precisely what the sciences can and can't do and why they're legitimate. We can kind of check that off now. We're done with that question. Whereas I take it that since for Gadamer, grounding the sciences is doing something like revealing the way in which the sciences kind of inform the situation I find myself in, that question has to be asked anew every time the situation that I find myself in changes, and that's kind of changing all the time. So it's not something we can just do once and be done with. It's kind of constantly got to be taken up again and again in a new way. And that's at least one respect in which his sense of grounding is very different from previous ones.
Okay, so I'm wondering whether his sense of grounding here helps to address science's irresponsibility that we saw earlier, right? If the other types of grounding were about legitimation of the authority of science and establishing it as being the ultimate authority of knowledge and as bearing the paradigm of knowledge, and as a result then leaving them sort of epistemically and maybe morally irresponsible, whether this version that shows science's limits then can help liberate science from that sort of irresponsibility. Ted.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how complicated it is. I'm thinking about the kind of experience about vaccine culture in the US during COVID. So there was a kind of general on the left Enlightenment idea that we should let the scientists be responsible for understanding whether or not we need to take vaccines.
Mhm.
And it was really kind of many on what you would associate with right-wing politics that took the hermeneutic turn and said, wait a minute, actually, scientists don't get to tell us what the ground of the legitimacy of these vaccines are. That's a political conversation, a social question that we should answer together. And I guess I was really quite surprised how much the political left just abandoned that hermeneutical grounding. And I kind of think it's interesting. So on the one hand, the scientists sort of assumed they would get responsibility and then didn't get it. And the people who criticized the right were correct. But then there was not a robust, legitimating conversation within society about what norms we should be using to follow, what the scope, limits, and validity of the vaccines were, that we came to a reasonable conclusion together about it. So I think, yes, this curbs the authority, the purported legitimacy of the sciences, but it also clarifies how much responsibility there is then within our social context to have the conversation, to really adjudicate what we think about what counts as legitimate or not. And I was really fascinated to see that play out and to see how little people on the left ended up participating in that conversation. Gadamer turned out to be absolutely right, that what turned out to be legitimating was the social conversation, not the sciences.
Robert, can I call you back in about 10 minutes?
But we didn't, yeah, sure. But we didn't take that ground seriously in the way that you would hope, maybe, if you're a real Gadamerian. That's the 2 cents thing.
Yeah, we didn't fight the battle on that ground, is what you're saying. Yeah, we got left. Yeah, fair enough. Eric.
Ted, you put your hand up before me, and I just want to repeat everything that you just said, except
I should let you go first.
Except, why did you say that the right had it right? Because they didn't, right? They weren't sufficiently self-consciously hermeneutical in their position, right? Because they're dogmatists.
Yeah. Well, I think what they had right was the source of ground. They were correct that what would ground the legitimacy of the knowledge about vaccines was a social conversation. I think that was right. And then
they did not say
that out.
You're being very charitable, very Gadamerian of you, but they didn't say that way.
Yeah, attorney.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you about that.
Yeah, they did say that. I mean, Attorney Barr gave a talk at a very conservative school near here where he said, we get to decide whether we're going to listen to science or something else, right? This is the conversation we need to have. We just don't automatically defer.
Yeah, I
Better
think
or
maybe
worse,
what
it was
I'm doing is
suspicious,
kind of
but-
like
it often became which
description of what
scientist.
happened, not a-
It often became which scientist, right? Because there was this gratifying, like viral nature of like, here are a few scientists that say, don't use vaccines or don't mask, right? They still used scientists to legitimate.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't think that's true. I think many of my friends and neighbors said, well, we want to keep our businesses open. We want our kids to go to school. There's lots of problems if they don't go to school. And I don't know that the legitimating ground of those claims was other scientific research. It might have been other sources of knowing, like family life or
Wow.
capitalist ideologies, whatever it is, like lots of different things.
John Arthos, I think
I
you're ready
didn't
to
find
go.
that silo opening up on the left. I thought that the left kind of was like, nope, science. And then that was always going to be the legitimating ground for people who are pro-vaccine. Whereas I thought the others had other sources of legitimation that thickened the conversation.
Yeah, so I want to support this aspect of Ted's comment. So there is this reflexive, on the sort of the center left mainstream, at least in the public discourse on cable news, this sort of reflexive apotheosis of science and fact, as opposed to prejudice, right? And I think what we're doing then is we're really repeating. I mean, to correct that, we have to repeat Gadamer's argument, which is that the point is not to abolish science or to denigrate it, but to find its proper place in the discourse, right? So this goes back to what Tom and I were talking about, which is that, the problem for Gadamer's perspective is the status marginality of the humanities and of Socratic ignorance and of practical reasoning, that he actually, I believe, wants to reverse the order of privilege, not the royal road of science. That doesn't dominate absolutely with absolute grounds and certainty, as too many people in the popular imagination imagine, right? He wants to say that has its place, that it really does involve this more fundamental conversation that we are, right? That we have this conversation, but we also need to recognize that we have to, at certain points, rely on empirical evidence, right? He doesn't want to deny that. That's so crucial, that we have to rely on good reasons and scientific experimentation and all of this. So in a sense, I think I'm agreeing with Ted on this, that was missing from the conversation on the left.
Yeah, and I'm basically left-minded about these things, but I was surprised by how little we participated in that part of the conversation and tried to adjudicate what we were learning from the empirical evidence. I don't think my friends and colleagues had a really strong argument about why it was better for kids to be staying home from school that actually addressed the arguments that conservative parents had about keeping them in school. I mean, we had arguments about why they should be taking vaccines, but it didn't really open up.
Tom.
Thanks. It's a really interesting point that Ted made, and one that I can talk about for hours. But it's just a side note, really, about in the UK, there's this extra turn on all this now, because they've released, if people don't know, they've released the WhatsApp conversations between government ministers that took place during the pandemic. So now and there's something quite nice, and if anyone in this talk wants to write a paper about it, please do, because someone needs to, right? About the role of information, the role of the scope of science, the role of you know, the sort of openness to conversation, and the role of dialogue within it. I think it sort of captures, in a way, perhaps what I was trying to say earlier about information going far beyond the kind of uses that Gadamer might have anticipated, but still Gadamer, his work speaks to it a lot. And the basic answer, it's not very straightforward, because you've kind of got layers and layers of different sort of, whether there's fusions or not, or unfusions, or and different applications of practical rationality and so on. But anyway, it was just to raise that, because it's the current talking point over here in the UK at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Greg.
Yeah, I was just going to add it. I think Ted's exactly right about this too. Although Eric is also right that there are lots of people on the right who were also like, oh, look here, we found this scientist who says the thing we want them to say. And kind of what I took away from that whole discourse, which I take it as part of the point Gadamer wants to make here about the irresponsibility of science, is just the danger that comes with living in a society that elevates anything, science included, to the status of unquestionable dogmatic truth. And I take it that especially in the political realm, right, making the move of saying, oh, we're just following the science, we're just doing what the scientists say, right, is, even if you know that really that's not a legitimate move, right, that move is like the one ring to rule them all, right? It's so powerful and so hard to resist, right, that I think everybody in politics, regardless of what kind of side of the spectrum they find themselves on, feels this really strong temptation to say, see, look, the scientists just vindicated what we were saying. Here's a study that shows that I'm right. And it's when you're on the other side of that, right, when what the scientists are saying doesn't, at least isn't usable for you in that way, that you kind of remember, oh yeah, wait a minute, science by itself can't actually answer any of these questions, right? Science can tell us, here's what will happen if people take vaccines, here's what will happen if they don't, here's what will happen if we close schools, here's what will happen if they don't. But how to weigh the various value, the weight of the various values and the trade-offs is not a question that science can or does answer. It's a social question, it's a political question. But we only tend to remember that truth when the move of saying, oh, science just supports my view is kind of not available to us. And that's why I think we've kind of seen both political sides switching back and forth as, you know, new studies have come out.
Great. So we only have a few minutes left, and I always want to give people the opportunity to bring things up that haven't been brought up. We jumped right in about halfway through this reading. And so if there's something that really excited you or upset you or confused you, or you really want a chance to talk about before we call it a day, now is the time. If not, if you feel like we've done good justice to everything, Eric.
So just double checking what page it is. It's when he first starts talking about Weltanschauung. So that would be page 160. And he starts talking about the expressive, so the plurality of Weltanschauungen, thought-forming labor of life. This meant that for the entirety of interpretation of the world, philosophy was no longer taken seriously in its claim to knowledge. Instead, it had a different function, which was basically topographical or typology. And that, for me, like looking at the comparative study of religions, this becomes like a really crucial question. Masuzawa has this book called The Invention of World Religions, exposing like the very categories like this is Islam, this is Buddhism, this is Hinduism, as all serving the interests of Eurocentric colonialism. And so, you know, like this sort of thing is where sometimes when reading Gadamer, I want him to say something a little more political, politically explicit here, but he just stops at, oh, it just became a typology. But then I think, Greg, you brought up earlier Thompson's book about like the politics of education. Like he could be riffing with this, but kind of doesn't.
Yeah. He does sort of stop at a few points and then rather than sort of taking the full completion, doesn't he? Other thoughts, other things to bring up? Okay, well, in that case, I want to thank everyone for coming and for joining us. It's been a great conversation. We're going to meet again in May, in mid-May. Should be nice out. And I'll have, if you have something you really want to discuss, send it to me. I'll put it on the list. And I'll send out a list of papers for us to vote on and decide what we're going to read next. So thanks, everybody. Have a good spring. See you in a couple months.